It's computational propaganda, which stems originally, right, Berit, from, and your work with Scout, starts with research that you began, what, last year?
Yeah, so it actually really began last June. Not this past June, but the one before that. I was, at Scout, we were getting kind of interested in Facebook because, you know, as millennials, we understand the true power that Facebook has on every single person that we know, as far as, you know, where you get your news, how it's shaping what you think about the world, how you see what your friends are posting, how that affects how you think about the world. And Facebook had just come out with a couple of studies, one of which proved that they could increase the number of people who actually voted in a given campaign, and the other of which proved that they could change someone's emotions.
This was Facebook's own research?
Yeah, they did two internal studies to kind of figure out how effective they were at, you know, changing how someone looked at the world or how they felt personally. And they found that they were both very effective. So we started looking into the newsfeed algorithm, because there was all of this hubbub around the trending news section. And we really felt like that was off base, right? So started talking to a few sources at Facebook, and we were able to actually determine that we reverse engineered the entire code review process for the newsfeed team, and we were able to determine that working together, two single engineers on the team could change the newsfeed algorithm to materially affect the outcome of an election without anyone else on the team ever knowing about it.
Wow.
So that was the beginning of, and that was before the primary campaign began. But flash forward to the day of the US election, and it was still something that we were very interested in still following. So we started to kind of look into how Facebook and other platforms were used during the election on behalf of the Trump campaign and on behalf of the Hillary campaign.
Right, and so that has led you to obviously, and so much stuff has gradually been coming out and filtering out since then, and obviously the pressure has been on the platforms themselves, not just Facebook. You've been looking at what we can now see of those, let's just start with the Russian campaigns that have been directed towards the United States, or were directed towards the United States in those last 6 months of the campaign, or beyond that, perhaps.
Yeah, so I think it's actually more useful to look at the system as a whole, because it wasn't necessarily one or the other, but where you really start to get some insight about the way this works is when you start looking at the whole network. In my case, I first came across this when I found the research of a guy named Jonathan Albright, who was a professor at Elon University at the time. He's now the head of Columbia's Tow Center for Digital Media, because his research has just been so right on all this stuff. And he actually scraped the web and found that there was this hidden network of news sites. There was a combination of Breitbart sites, RT, which is the Russian propaganda channel or news channel, fake news sites, and a bunch of alt-right news sites. And what was going on was that during the campaign, anytime bad news came out about Trump, these sites were actually all publishing content at the same time and linking to each other within seconds.
So that looked like collusion. I mean, it looks like
to me, that was the first indication. You know, I suspected a lot because the intelligence agencies has already come out and said that Russia was trying to manipulate the election back in September or something like that. But that to me was the first kind of digital proof that there may have, things may have been more serious or more involved technically than we first thought.
And that affects search engine optimization, which affects which of course magnifies their reach, right?
Yeah, so that the purpose of that is that anytime someone's searching Google or Facebook, you see that news first. The other purpose is it actually affects the trending topics on Facebook and Twitter and other social networks, so like YouTube, for example. And so anyone who's looking at those are going to generally see news that would normally not pop up to the surface through organic distribution.
You showed me, just before we came on, a bunch of the names of these sites. I mean, it's kind of, it's just illustrative, saying the same thing, but the names of those sites that we know were sourced directly to, those big nerve center buildings that we've heard about in Russia that were, government agencies effectively churning out this material. and we can route them directly to those buildings. And they were names like kind of Texas Patriots. What were the others?
Well, so what's really interesting, before we get to that, I think it's important to understand. So there was this SEO kind of engine going on. There was also a company called Cambridge Analytica that was doing something that is actually basically just really good marketing. And so what they would do is actually take those networks of news sites and see what people were engaging in. So like what kinds of topics specific people were reading, and then they would sort them into groups, right? And they would, once they were in those groups, they would retarget them on Facebook. So we started out talking about Facebook. They would use their news feed to serve them ads, either organically through through these Facebook groups that you're talking about, or through paid ads, right? And so the groups that they're sorting them into are actually pretty unexpected, in a way, right? So there's a group that's for the LGBTQ community. There's a Muslim American group. There's a Patriots in Texas group. There's a group that's like anti-immigration. But it really scans all of these like very Central American cultural issues, which is really representative of Russia's broader strategy, right? Which is
so talk about
let's
that.
foment.
What are they saying? I mean, what's actually on these sites? They aren't going in straight away saying, obviously, vote Trump or whatever.
Right.
They're going in and talking about literally anything initially.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, the whole idea, Russia's strategy is pretty smart actually. So, and they're not just, by the way, they're not just doing this in the United States. They're also doing this across Europe. And we heard, how this has happened already in Ukraine and Estonia. Have been kind of the original centers of this, but their goal is to undermine NATO and to undermine democracies generally, right? So the best way to do that is to make America look like a hot mess. And so what they do is they go into these various groups and cultural, and basically just try to incite cultural rifts, right? They try to make the things that Americans normally disagree on a really regular basis, right? Things like LGBTQ rights, right? Should gay people be able to get married? Things like, should immigration be more or less open? Things like, police violence against African American communities. They take those and they feed both sides. So they were actually feeding the African American communities and they were feeding the other side at the same time, so that it really just continues to foment this anger and increasing polarization in the United States.
And that is a political strategy in itself.
Yes, that's Russia's political strategy.
But they also wanted Donald Trump to win, right? So, I mean, at least this is the impression we're certainly getting from Russia directly itself in the run-up to the election. And it must have been a considered strategy that generating just a greater sense of rage and a greater sense of that turbulence was playing into him and obviously not into the Clinton campaign.
Yes, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but his audience does tend to respond well to that.
I know, his audience does, but I mean, America generally had to vote for him, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, America generally, technically, if we're counting like the total votes in America, didn't vote for him.
No, I know, but enough of them did that he swung it. So,
yeah.
And tell me about the targeting as well. This is the other thing, right? They were looking towards the end. We know whether they were literally going for those key states, Wisconsin and Florida and those other places. Were they literally, how sophisticated were they in terms of the targeting?
So this is where the Cambridge Analytica, this is actually more of the campaign. They were quite sophisticated, right? So for the first time, Cambridge Analytica has, their kind of PR claim to fame is that they have a personality profile for every single American voter. Now they developed those through a Facebook, by correlating people's Facebook likes with their personality profiles. And they did it actually in this really kind of cagey way. They used Amazon's Mechanical Turk service and kind of broke all these terms of service, not telling them that they were actually, they got all these volunteers and didn't tell them that they were actually giving them access to their friends' Facebook likes as well. So a couple of them were actually reported, which is how this was discovered. And they were replicating the research of a pretty intelligent guy from Cambridge at the time, which is where the name came from. So they actually stole and replicated his research and then turned it into this ability to, by looking at someone's Facebook likes, figure out what their personality would be, right? The interesting thing about that is that once you have their personality, you can kind of tell what types of persuasion techniques they're actually more likely to be affected by. And from there, moving forward, you combine that actually with the data that's just available on the open market, right? So Facebook, this was actually the first election where Facebook allowed you to target by zip code. because they had just had this big combination, this big input of data from big data providers. And so for the first time, they were actually able to have this very sophisticated and very targeted strategy. So they didn't need to target, states that were clearly not swing states. But what they did is they were able to sense, based on how people were reacting to these ads in very specific swing districts and swing states, who was most receptive to which messages. And then they would actually tailor their campaign events in those communities to those exact same messages. So it was a pretty smart strategy. They were using what they learned about through users' engagement on Facebook to drive their on-the-ground campaign efforts. The thing that is a little tricky about this is Facebook. They were using this thing called dark ads a lot of the time, and dark ads it just means that they can only be seen by whoever's feed they're in, right? So there's no visibility into who bought the ad or like the content of the ad, how they're being targeted. And in fact, a lot of the time they might not even know that they're being targeted at all. It might just look like a story that a friend shared in their newsfeed, or it might be marketed as like, hey, your friend read the story, right? And that's something, at least in U.S. politics, that is pretty unprecedented. And Facebook has actually now reversed that.
Really?
Yeah, they've gone back and said that they're no longer going to allow that with political ads.
We are, well, they're not allowed with political ads, but of course.
But these ads,
what
of
is
course,
a political ad?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we know that there are limits on what a campaign can do and spend in terms of orthodox media advertising. Mm-hmm. Clearly, those limitations can't be applied. So we don't, when it comes to the likes of Facebook, right? So this is entirely uncharted territory in terms of any kind of formal regulation in the US.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we know about levels of can we say anything more about levels of spending on the part of, let's say, the Trump campaign within this area, since you don't need to declare this kind of thing?
Well, can we say anything more about levels of spending?
Do you know what I mean? I mean, if there are limits on what spending, what is spending, what they're formally spending, what they're formally investing into these areas, we know that the Trump campaign put extra effort to generate separately.
In the U.S., we don't really like to limit spending that much.
I know.
We've created all these nice workarounds, so that really doesn't matter anymore.
Tell me then about, let's move on about getting to not so much what they were saying, but the reaction of the network or the platforms, because I mean that perhaps is the most significant and interesting thing here, right? I mean, we've had the campaign. We know that the Russians have been attempting similar efforts during the Brexit referendum in the UK, and obviously the French election, Dutch election, German election, and so on. So this is an ongoing strategy.
Yeah.
It's a given. How do the platforms themselves respond to this? How are they responding, and what is the political pushback against them?
So a couple of things. One, I think it's really important to understand that this is not just something that happened during the U.S. election, right? So we've got the SEO aspect, we've got the Facebook dark ads aspect. The third aspect, which we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, is the role of Facebook and Twitter bots, right? So one of the things over the course of the last year, I've had multiple conversations with the Oxford Computational Propaganda team, and they really pioneered. They were some of the first people to discover that people were creating these fake Facebook and Twitter profiles to change the course of conversations online. They first discovered it during the Arab Spring. They just happened to be monitoring Twitter and studying how Twitter was being used for the purpose of organizing. And all of a sudden, these fake profiles started popping up that were inciting, starting fights and giving misinformation, magnifying specific viewpoints and not others. And so they started studying this. And what they found is that there's actually this enormous ecosystem of bots and bot networks that are, just bought and sold generally on the market, and they're used for many things. But Russia, in particular, has something called the Internet Research Agency, which is just a building full of Russian people who are paid to run these fake profiles, and pretend that they're Americans, at least in this case. So throughout the course of, the history of bot propaganda, the same groups of bots, one of the things that they found is that the same groups of bots that were used during the Arab Spring were actually shut down and then reactivated during the Brexit campaign, and then shut down and then reactivated during the US election, right? So you can see these kinds of patterns of influence where it's like major election points, major flashpoint elections, these networks are really reactivated and reapplied in this continued attempt to undermine democracies generally, or to subvert the role of Western civilizations, Western countries.
So
And
just explain, I'm sorry, dumb question perhaps, but you have a bot network with a bunch of fake accounts of, I don't know, red-blooded Americans who all hate immigration, for example.
well, they
You
start
shut
off
them
as
down.
they start off as go ahead.
No,
sorry.
no, yeah. So I'm just saying they shut those down, and they crop up as a bunch of kind of disgruntled northern British people who don't like the idea of Europe meddling in British affairs.
Yes, exactly. So the value of a bot, a single bot, is really only as big as its social network, right? Because that's how it pretends to be a real person. So you don't want to start over every time if you don't have to. And by the way, like Twitter and Facebook are removing some of these. So you're trying to really maintain your bot network, and the bots that are operated by humans are much more effective than those that are automated. So so they basically just change the pictures, slap a new profile description on there.
And you shut them down and you leave them dormant, which is a better way actually of keeping them alive, right?
Yes,
Because
yeah.
they're not going to get shut down like that. So tell me then about this reaction. You're saying that some of these have been shut down since, and we like I say, we know about the campaigns and the efforts and some of the mitigation efforts put in place in the European election campaign since. But how, well, what's the evidence, I suppose, of a dynamic effort on the part of Facebook and Google and others to come up with solutions, given the pressure that's coming at them now from the political classes in Washington and so on?
I would say very small, very thin. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, directly after the election was at the Aspen Institute, and he said, "There's no way that Facebook could have been, a part of the outcome of this election." Now,
But even though Facebook 6 months earlier had produced evidence showing how influential they were.
Yeah. And I mean, he knew, right? So he's a CEO. He has a fiduciary responsibility. He has to, he's going to deny. I think the thing that's been really interesting to watch is, we know that Russia tried to change the outcome of the election. What we don't know is how successful they were, or what their total reach was, or how many people were indoctrinated into into these networks. Although there has, so interestingly enough, Jonathan Albright, the same guy that originally discovered the SEO network, just put out new research using a Facebook ad tool that found that it wasn't just $100,000 worth of ads, but the organic posts from just those 6 pages that were identified with the Internet Research Agency, just those 6 pages had reached hundreds of millions of people organically. Now, immediately after that happened, Facebook went in and shut down all of that data, which was publicly accessible before. And so now all of these researchers who are trying to help in the U.S. the investigative committees figure out what was going on, no longer had access to that data. So I mean, they have done some good things. They've made a commitment to make, as I mentioned, political ads public. But what's needed is really something that's much more exhaustive than that. And it's been clear that DC is growing very, very frustrated with this. Like we know there's blood on the floor, right? Like Facebook is basically a crime scene, and we know that there might be a dead body in that closed door behind the bedroom, but they're not really letting anyone in to see. So.
That's Facebook. I mean, Twitter?
Twitter has also been less than responsive, right? So they went in to the Senate hearing, and they said, "Okay, guys, this is great. We're being very cooperative. We did a deep analysis of our network, and we found that those 6 people that were identified by Facebook, we looked at them, and there aren't that many of them on Twitter, right? So, I mean, in all of these cases, these companies have an incentive to have more users, right? And Facebook has gotten in a little bit of trouble recently because they had more users in the United States than there are citizens. So there's a high volume of fake profiles on all of these sites. Facebook shut down 30,000 accounts ahead of the French election, right? They were trying to interfere. we know that Germany was very strict with these companies and said, if there is anything that is fake news before our election and it's reported and you don't do something about it within 24 hours, we're going to fine you. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it was like $24 million, which is not a lot for Facebook on an individual basis, but it could add up pretty quickly if they weren't being responsive.
Absolutely. Questions, guys? Remember where the mics are if you want to ask anything. So how easy, I mean, this is I suppose the multi-million-dollar question. With the, they aren't closing many things down, or they haven't been closing many things down. There's been plenty of denial. How easy do we actually think a rigorous response would be? I mean, perhaps some of these bot networks and, the stuff coming out of these Russian industrial complexes didn't have to be very sophisticated. Like they said, some of the original hacking of the DNC computers wasn't that sophisticated because they just hey, we didn't even think it would work. This was so easy. It was like taking candy from a child, right? So as soon as Facebook does start pushing back, they'll, obviously it'll be an arms race and they'll get better at doing it. How easy do you think, given the present level of sophistication of these attacks, it would be for the likes of Facebook to make a meaningful response? I mean, do you think it really would be just like that, or do you think it's a kind of reputational, financial thing that Facebook's saying to itself, we cannot afford, because of our bottom line, to be meddling in the free speech of our users to this level?
So there are a couple things. One, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here, right? There's a lot that can be done very easily. They've already made moves, at least in lip service, to make some significant changes, Facebook especially. I think Google has been maybe more responsible as far as like looking into its own data and opening that up by a small margin. But there's a lot of things that they could do very easily to shut this problem down, including some of the things that they've already started to do. I think the bigger picture, and the thing that's really interesting to me is like, let's forget about this last election almost, right? Because moving forward, what's really interesting is this ability to, in the next election, in 2018, Robert Mercer, who was the biggest investor in Trump's campaign, is the biggest investor in Breitbart, and it was the biggest investor in Cambridge Analytica, they're already getting ready to use the same tactics and techniques in 2018, right? And they've, Bannon actually came out on Fox News the other day and said, we're going to take down all of the Republican candidates. The only one that's safe is Cruz. That was essentially his message. So there is this, in the United States, this kind of alt-right propaganda machine run by the Mercer family that is being used very heavily in politics.
And you said it was already more sophisticated than the Russians in some ways.
Yes, I would say significantly. So Robert Mercer, he made his money in algorithmic trading. He's a billionaire. He's a genius, right? He's a savant. And he has created this network of media faculties and properties that can execute on that. Cambridge Analytica was involved in the Kenyan election recently on behalf of the candidate, the candidate that was running for re-election, and that campaign was recently declared null because it was found that 5 million votes had been tampered with. We know that they have an office in India. They're running operations in South America because data regulations are very lax there. They're actually working on behalf of what used to be the organization that responded to Russian propaganda and fought back against Russian propaganda. So they're now running their digital operations. So it's not just about, this problem is a lot bigger than just, did Russia interfere in the US election? Clearly, yes, they did, and they're going to continue to interfere.
This is the new phase of campaigning.
Yes, this is the future of politics. And it's, there's been a lot of kind of questions and back and forth about how effective was Cambridge Analytica really? Did they really have personality profiles for everyone? All of those questions, are worth revisiting. But in the meantime, they're already working on the next step, and they figured out how to do it better, right? So this is something going forward that's really going to change the face of. It raises questions like, how do you have a democratic society if you can't control, how people are being lied to, or if you can't, if you, there's no way for you personally to know what's true, right?
Question?
Yeah, I think that what Berit just said was the most significant moment, and that's how do you tell what's true? And it's the one thing that, Ed, you spoke about, the arms race. And there's no way out of this except to restore the ability of fact to refute rumor. And that's the elephant in this room that's barely been mentioned and barely been mentioned by any of the studies that you're talking about, and certainly not by Facebook, and I was there a few months ago talking about this. The problem is that all of the fact-using professions, from teaching and science to journalism, and now the deep state fact-using professions of the military officer corps and the intelligence agencies are all under attack because they have a weapon that can shut all this down, and that's credibility systems. What I would like you to comment on is whether or not it might be possible to set up any kind of a fact or credibility system that is not automatically discredited by the political partisans. Do you think some great council of sages, ex-presidents, Sandra Day O'Connor, could set up something that would be so above reproach that it would be able to say that's not true?
You know, David, I'm really glad you asked that question, because after the Ukraine panel, I was hanging out with the members of that panel, and we had this exact discussion, and we actually solved the problem. So the idea that we kind of came up with was, and this happens in Ukraine, right? They have a system for doing this, but there's a difference between the way that Ukraine looks at truth and the way that the U.S. looks at truth, which is the U.S. places a much higher value on freedom of speech as opposed to truth. And so what we decided is, if you set up a system where it would have to be user reported, right? So a user could report something as untrue on a network. There would then be a bipartisan group of fact checkers who would have to both sides approve the fact that this fact was true or untrue. And then that content would be a ding against that provider, right? So whoever had shared the content, their content would then be slightly decelerated in the algorithmic, it would be demoted slightly in the algorithm. Yes.
Well,
so no one should go into another country and handpick their presidents, right? And this can be done through propaganda or sending an army or in any way. And I guess we can assume that American intelligence services have done similar things in the past. So are we horrified that now we are tasting our own medicine? And so then what do? Do we tell them, hey, stop meddling in our elections, but we will continue to meddle in yours? Or let's stop all the way and just choose whoever you want?
Difficult question to answer. I mean, do you have something to say? Well, I mean, I was going to just say, obviously, we are just looking at a different level of destabilization in terms of the format in which it is coming. You're quite right, obviously, and the record of the CIA and other agencies going back decades in parts of the world is well recorded and documented. But I suppose the issue here is it is wider, as Berit's just said, it is wider, isn't it, than the specific record of what the Russians have done. It is actually that the weapons exist. And it is the fact that the weapons, we don't have a clear, you can't actually have a parallel pushback against that weapon with an equivalent weapon. And I think that probably is the wider issue here, isn't it? Sorry, one quick time for one more question.
Yeah, I just thought that the word solved was a little bit strong, because some of the most polarizing,
That's fair.
polarizing things are, just yesterday it was Trump had proposed increasing the nuclear arsenal, 10x, but behind closed doors. How is any bipartisan committee going to really know the answer to that? The other one that was a real bombshell was in Trump's meeting with the Russians. He called Comey a nutcase and said, "Oh boy, I'm glad we got rid of him. He was, the pressure is relieved." there's just no way you can verify that,
Well, not everything, right? So you're right that there are some things that are a lot harder to verify as true or false than others. But there are a lot of things out there that are just blatant misinformation, blatant deliberate misinformation. And so you see it on both sides, right? It's not just the right, it's not just the left, it happens on the left as well. And there is, like, you're right, there are certain, like, anonymous sources, right, that come out and say things. The problem is that, but a lot of it is below that. It's a lot easier to deal with than what you're talking about.
I suppose it also is if you initiate a language whereby there is a globally understood sort of effort to establish dispassionate, impartial truth, at least there would be a forum in which people would perhaps more widely would understand this is a central place where we're making this effort. We understand everything is contentious, but at least there is a central board which is bigger than one news network, for example.
I want to just make one more comment about
Quickly,
Will's question.
we're overrunning.
Yeah, which is I think, so what's really interesting, and we heard this a bit on the Ukraine panel, is that for you're right, the U.S. has done this for years, right? And what's fascinating about the situation is that for the first time, we are way behind as far as weapons are concerned, right? Like, we are fighting. Yeah. And people don't know what to do about it. So I think we're going to see this play out a lot in the coming years. It's like the U.S. needs to figure out how is it going to play in this new world where it's actually really not about weapons necessarily. It's really about your ability to hack into other countries and manipulate people's minds and emotions.
We better stop there.
One more question. Point of privilege.
Okay.
As long as you don't pull us off the stage.
I'm not going to pull you off the stage.
Yeah, go on.
Good guest you've got there, Ed.
Yeah. We should have her on again.
Yeah, I think we should. Berit, do you think it's possible to take your idea about this whole thing about two parties approving and however you find a way to approve the news, could you combine that with something like the certificate work that Jeff Hudson's doing, so that and kind of the Microsoft approach or the Norton approach to a safe website, so that someone would come to a news article and instantly on their browser it would say, this is shit, or this is approved, and here's a little icon here that shows you that group said this is probably good news, real news.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible to do that, and I think
there's a verification standard on identities in Twitter already, right?
Yeah.
So
I think the biggest problem is that it's going to be convincing people and moving people out of these networks of misinformation, right? So the trick is, and the reason that this is so tough is because once people are indoctrinated into these specific networks and specific groups, that's where they get their information from. And so finding a verified system that could appeal to those people or actually work with those people requires a deep social re-engineering, and that's really the real, I think.
Or they just get used to all their news has a red dot on it.
Yeah.
it's a point of honor. Good. Thank you very much.